To really grasp the stakes here, we have to look at two drastically competing visions. Right after independence, India's leadership, including Jawaharlal Nehru, envisioned these massive dams as the modern temples of development. They were meant to be these grand monuments to progress and secular nationalism. But for the indigenous Adivasi and Dalit communities actually living along those riverbanks, the reality was entirely different. Activists have described these exact same projects as a mass grave of tribal culture and economic self-sufficiency. And as we go through this explainer, you'll see how these two very different realities are just constantly colliding. And when we're talking about the scale of this vision, we really need to talk about this number, 3,200. That is the staggering, almost unbelievable amount of dams envisioned by the Narmada Valley Development Project. We're talking 30 major ones, 135 medium ones, and literally thousands of smaller ones. The ultimate goal was to completely reconstitute the 1,312-kilometer river and its 41 tributaries into this massive interconnected staircase of reservoirs to generate power and irrigate millions of hectares of land. It's a breathtaking scope. Section 1. The Narmada Valley Vision. Engineering a mega project. The whole transformation of the Narmada Basin was designed to be an absolute triumph of structural modernization. You can see how the geographic footprint, the natural flow of the river basin, was entirely redrawn into this incredibly dense mechanized network. A sacred terminal basin watercourse was fundamentally changed into a highly controlled hub of irrigation, power lines, and canals, basically shifting vital resources to arid regions thousands of kilometers away. The Bargi Dam itself, which is officially the Rani Avantibai Lodhi Sagar project, was the very first major completed structure in this whole chain. It is a massive gravity dam standing nearly 70 meters high. It's equipped with Francis and Kaplan turbines that generate 105 megawatts of power. Plus, it feeds a 137-kilometer left bank canal system that brings vital irrigation to over 133,000 hectares of agricultural land, while also supplying 54 million cubic meters of drinking water to the city of Jabalpur. So, the economic benefits and the sheer engineering outputs, they're undeniably impressive. Section 2. The Submergence. Counting the human cost. But securing all those resources required flooding a massive amount of land, shifting our focus from the triumphs of concrete and megawatts to the severe, cascading human consequences created by the Bargi Reservoir. There is an incredibly stark contrast between the official policy and what people actually lived through. The state tribunal promised this really progressive land-for-land rehabilitation. Displaced families were supposed to get at least 2 hectares of land, new schools, community infrastructure, the whole works. But the reality on the ground, according to sociologists and NGOs who were actually there, was vastly different. Because many marginalized Adivasi communities lacked formal land titles, they ended up receiving little to absolutely no compensation. Instead, they faced forced eviction into urban slums in Jabalpur, the total loss of their traditional grazing and fishing rights, and were completely cut off from the self-sufficient forest economies they had relied on for generations. The human toll here translates to some pretty staggering figures. Over 27,000 hectares of land, that is roughly 103 square miles, just vanished underwater. 162 villages were entirely inundated. Over 5,400 families were displaced from their ancestral homes. We aren't just talking about moving houses, right? We're talking about the complete destruction of self-sufficient communities. People who once lived off the river's fish and the forest's grazing lands suddenly found themselves pushed into poverty. It fundamentally ripped apart the social fabric of the entire valley. Section 3. Rise of the Resistance. Mobilizing the Narmada Valley. This systematic failure of the rehabilitation programs didn't just go unnoticed. It ignited a fierce grassroots resistance movement, one that would eventually capture the attention of the entire world. And the momentum built rapidly. Back in the 1980s, local activists really started documenting these massive rehabilitation failures and organizing the locals. By 1988, various grassroots groups merged to form the Narmada Bachao Andolan, the Save the Narmadan movement. Just a year later, an incredible 50,000 people gathered in the town of Harsud to protest what they saw as deeply destructive development. And specifically at the Bargi Dam itself, the displaced people formed a union in 1992, the Bargi Matsya Mahasangh, to fiercely fight for the right to fish in the very reservoir that had swallowed their homes. The method they chose to protest is really vital to understand here. They employed satyagraha, the Gandhian tradition of nonviolent civil disobedience. In some of the most dramatic, frankly awe-inspiring protests, displaced villagers would literally stand in the rising waters of the reservoirs, vowing to drown rather than abandon their claims to the land. It was a profound assertion of their rights and a powerful demand to be seen not as passive victims, but as actual stakeholders in their own environment. Section 4, the 2026 cruise tragedy, a failure of oversight. Fast forward to May 2026. The Bargi Dam Reservoir, which, remember, was originally built for irrigation and power, was eventually marketed as a modern tourist destination, complete with resorts and boat cruises. But treating a mechanized river as a recreational space requires strict, unwavering safety oversight. Oversight that, tragically, failed completely. In early May 2026, a devastating disaster unfolded through a rapid sequence of compounding safety lapses. A cruise boat was loaded with over 40 passengers, even though only 29 tickets were actually issued. It was allowed to sail despite the meteorological department issuing an orange alert for severe storms, and winds that day ultimately reached 74 kilometers per hour. Survivors later reported that life jackets were literally kept sealed away and were only handed out in a panicked scuffle as the boat began taking on water. To make matters worse, the operator reportedly ignored frantic signals from locals on the shore, desperately telling him to turn back. The boat capsized just 300 meters from the shore. 11 lives were lost that day. When rescue divers finally reached the sunken vessel, they encountered an absolutely heartbreaking scene. They found a mother who had held so tightly to her 4-year-old son that they couldn't be separated. In the sudden panic, they had both been bound into a single sealed life jacket. It is an incredibly sobering, tragic reminder of the ultimate human cost of systemic negligence. Section 5, the GAM's dual legacy, progress versus protection. Ultimately, we are left with two drastically different legacies that are inextricably linked together forever. On one side of the riverbanks, you have this massive, concrete infrastructure of the dam. It is an undeniable engine for agricultural growth, electricity, and urban modernization. But on the exact same river, you have traditional communities, fragile, deeply connected to the natural landscape, and highly vulnerable to the decisions made by centralized authorities. Whether that's forced displacement back in the 1990s or a complete lack of safety enforcement in 2026, the vulnerability is the same. So the story of the Narmada River leaves us with a really critical, lingering question. When a natural landscape is fundamentally mechanized for what policymakers call the greater common good, who truly manages the risks and who is ultimately forced to bear the costs? It's an ethical balance that we absolutely must continue to ponder as global infrastructure expands. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this fascinating